All right, let's be opening our Bibles to Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. We are slowly working our way through Hebrews chapter 12. We're not in a rush to get done, but we're going to try to cover a bigger section than we covered last week. Last week, I think we basically covered 3.5 verses, but it was important because it was the conclusion to chapter 11. So it was really important that we understood the main point he was trying to make about chapter 11. So we did spend some time on that last week. We are going to pick right back up in basically verse 2. We're going to recap verse 2, 3, and 4, and then we'll move on to some additional questions. I did not put a new sheet of notes out on the back table today. I will next week for chapter 13. So we're still working off chapter 12 notes, and there's probably a small handful of those. I think we put them in that little tri-shelf on the back wall. So if you're interested in a copy of those, you can grab those, or just listen. We'll state the question, and then we'll move on. Right now, we're working off of question number 2 on the notes for chapter 12, and question number 2 is about the sacrifice of Jesus. Question 2 is this: the sacrifice of Jesus has incredible practical benefit. What encouragement should we take from it? That is from the sacrifice of Jesus. And we've already made a couple of points. One, we noted in verse 2 that in the race we keep our eyes focused on Jesus, right? So we're not looking back, we're not looking to the side, we're not looking down. Our eyes are set on the Lord. And in the context of a race, which he introduced to us in verse 1, we said that's extremely important. We even made the note last week that the most successful runners will tell you that one of the best things to do in a race is to keep your eyes focused on something ahead, and that's exactly what we're doing with Jesus. So his work is now set before us, right? His work is set before us. And we saw also last week the language that he is the author and the finisher, or the perfecter of our faith. He's the one who has gone before us, and as such, he sets the example for us. I don't want to go too fast beyond this, because I think this is about where we made it last week. So I want to sort of slow down now and note verse 2 again, when he says he's the author and the finisher of our faith. And he mentions, for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, despised the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And I want to look at that language just a little bit. We noted last week when we were ending that because Jesus finished the race, he did that, he gives encouragement to us that we can do exactly the same thing. The question is, how did he do that, though? How did he become the author or the chief, the leader, the prince, the pioneer of our faith, and also the perfecter of our faith? So he mentions 2 things here in verse 2. It says he endured the cross. What's that a reference to? Crucifixion. Does it tell us anything by the language about the level of suffering involved in the crucifixion, in his death? Yeah, that was an extremely great trial. Art?
Well, we know he tried. He asked his father 3 times, can we do this another way?
Some other way, yeah.
He said, okay, whatever, your will, I'll do it.
Yeah, what kind of anguish was involved in the cross? You know, sometimes we focus on the physical. Was there more than just physical suffering?
There was shame.
Yeah, there was shame. It even says here he despised the shame, so there was shame involved in it. Was there a great weight mentally, emotionally on the Lord doing what he did? It's incredible. It's hard for us to even imagine the kind of suffering that he endured. But the idea is this death by crucifixion and everything that was involved in that, he suffered through that and made it to the other side. And then as Gene mentioned, it mentions here he despised the shame, or literally he disregarded the shame. So obviously there was shame in the cross. But what does it mean he disregarded that? In the context of this, as an encouragement to the readers, what does it mean?
I think that it would mean, one thing it would mean is he didn't let what he was facing and what he was going through stop him.
Okay, I think that's exactly it. Crucifixion Who was that mainly reserved for in the first century? Criminals and lowlifes. I mean, they were the ones who were usually subjected to that. People who were fugitives, you know, just the lowest of the low, and he was subjected to that. In fact, to go along with that, just thinking out loud, he was sold for 30 pieces of silver, which was the price. Do you know what the price was for 30 pieces of silver? Who generally was sold for 30 pieces of silver in the first century? Just slaves. I mean, he was treated like dirt. And I think what Tommy said was true. The idea is here, regardless of whatever shameful thing he was subjected to, he never let it stop him from completing the goal. And we've got Old Testament scriptures that go along with that, like Isaiah 53 or Psalm 22, great scriptures that talk about how he was subjected to great abuse and great shame, and yet he pushed through that. And the writer here in verse 2 tells us how he was able to do that. How could he do that? What did he put before him that allowed him to push through all of that and make it to the other end? Okay, it says who for the joy that was set before him. And that's hard to think when you're in such terrible circumstances that anything could be joyous about what you're enduring. But I think what Gloria said is true. There was something on the other side of that. What stood on the other side? Heaven, going back and being with his Father. You remember John 17, verse 5, I think it is, when he's praying to the Father, he says that he would restore the glory that he had before he came. And so there was a restoration of all of those things. So he accomplished his Father's will, brought salvation to man, which is part of his joy, and allowed him to unite with his Father. And if he can do that, as tough as it may be for the present, we can do the same. In verse 3, it mentions that he endured hostility for sinners against himself. So notice verse 3, consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you be weary and discouraged in your soul. Hostility here means rebellion, contradiction, right? He ran up against opposition at every turn. Daily he ran up against opposition. And there was a trial constantly to sort of trap him in his words, take him out of context, call him names, bear false witness against him. All these things were true constantly of Jesus, and yet he endured all of those things. And we look to him to avoid the pitfalls of life, especially weariness or fatigue and discouragement, losing heart. So if he can do that, and by his example offers us a way to make it through, then we can do the same. And then here is I think verse 4 is the segue between the end of this thought in number 2 question and then beginning in number 3, which is he also resisted unto blood, and we should do the same. In verse 4 it mentions you have not yet resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin. And here's the idea of him dying. Obviously his commitment to the Father's will brought him to the point that he would die for his Father's will, and he's reminding the readers that they've not yet reached that point themselves. And I want to say more about that in just a minute. But it's true that the strife against sin could call for our death, just like it did for Jesus. And we should be smart, and we can be wise, and we don't have to just put ourselves in that situation. Right? In Matthew 10, when Jesus sent his disciples out on a limited commission, he did say, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. And if somebody tries to persecute you in a city, go to the next city, right? Don't just willfully subject yourself to that. But if need be, then you have to do it. And so I think he presents the great example of the Lord in verses 2 through verse 4. So let's move to the next question, because I want to sort of take that idea of verse 4 and sort of draw into the next question, because he does deal with, through verse 11, the issue of trials and suffering. He'll call it discipline here, but it's all sort of related. So question number 3 is this, and I think we'll spend the bulk of our time on this because there's some really great points here. The writer, number 3, explores the deeper side of our struggles in verses 4 through 11. What points does he make that helps us to put suffering into perspective? And what do you get out of this? In reading verses 4 through 11, what do you get out of this? How should we view struggles in this life and trial in this life? What are your thoughts on that? Okay, so one thing, it doesn't last forever. It's easy to think it's the end of everything and it's going to last forever and ever, but it really isn't. There's something on the other side. Philip, you had your hand up?
Really, you're struggling
Yes.
It's a training ground, like
Yeah.
in the military, you know, you train for something.
Yeah.
And we're training for something even greater than we could ever think about.
In the moment of suffering, though, do we typically step back and go, this is great because I'm being trained for something better? That's not what we do. That's not how we think of it. But what you said is true, and he's going to mention that because there's some correction that God can provide through that. Terry, you had your hand up. It is. It's hard to be, which means that we have to choose to be joyful in that moment. It's not a circumstantial thing because, in fact, when we get down to verse 11, he'll say that any kind of these trials, no chastening, for the present, what does it not seem like? It's not really fun to go through. He'll say, no chastening seems to be joyful for the present. But joy is a choice in that moment, and so we'll take a look at that. Any other thoughts on suffering, especially from this passage? What do you get out of it as far as perspective?
You know, a diamond is just an ugly rock
It is
until it's ground and polished.
polished and cut just right, and so there's some refining that has to go on to be made right and to be valuable, and I think that's certainly true here. Let's look at some of the points he makes, beginning in verse 4. And to me, this sort of goes to a couple things that have been said. It's a very, very practical point. We noted it just then, but look at verse 4. You have not resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin. And so his point here is that struggles could end in what? What could be the end of our struggles? It could be that, and it has for many. Many have resisted to bloodshed. And in a way, I think this helps us to realize that as we sometimes say it, I don't know that sometimes we believe it, we say, well, things could be worse. Is that true? Could things be worse sometimes? And that's his point here. They were struggling, right? They were really struggling, and whatever their struggles were to this point, it was sort of wrecking their faith. But he's reminding them, your suffering could be a lot worse than it is now, and it's not to the level of giving your life for the faith. It could reach that point, but it's not there now. And so the writer holds out martyrdom as the potential end of suffering and persecution. Yeah, Bobby?
This is the level of persecution that they're going to see in the very near future.
Yeah, in the future, things will turn. And so part of it is to say, if you can't handle it now, you're not going to be able to handle it in the future, but you need to learn how to handle it now so you can handle it in the future. So let's think about it practically. Is it the case that in our culture, if you're just trying to do the right thing, you're standing up for morals, you're a Christian, you believe in Christianity, might you be called names in our culture? You're probably going to be. You're going to be labeled, but could it be worse? What could be worse? Yeah, you could be put in prison. Like in the first century, they might have been called names, but they hadn't been crucified for their faith, like the Lord was in verse 4, or like others in chapter 11 were sawn in half and stoned and beaten to death. They hadn't reached that point, so yeah, it's tough to experience being called names and being labeled, but there's bloodshed. You've not resisted to that point. Or let's just take it out of the context of persecution. Let's just take general trials. Is it bad to experience sickness and physical setbacks? That's no fun, right? Nobody likes to be in the hospital. Nobody likes to have a diagnosis and say, hey, something's going on with your body, but we can fix that. That's still a struggle. What could be worse? Somebody can say, hey, you've got terminal illness and there's nothing we could do for you. Or you could be looking at death, and that's certainly much worse. And so sometimes when we're struggling, we don't say, it could be worse. And it really could be, because we think at the moment it's just terrible. When you have stress at the job, when you're just trying to pay the bills, it could be worse. You might not have any job. You could have no work. You could have no food like some people in the world. So it's always worse. And he's reminding them that while he's not minimizing their suffering now, he's saying that there is bloodshed that you've not yet arrived at, and that is certainly worse. So perspective is everything in suffering. And often we embellish our suffering as if it's the worst that anybody's ever gone through, like no one's ever struggled like we have. And the truth is none of us never suffer as greatly as Jesus. None of us will ever struggle like that. None of us will ever have the emotional and spiritual weight placed upon us to try to save people from their sins. So there's a sense in which, while struggling is bad and it's not joyful for the present, we've never and will never have it as bad as some people have had it, like the Lord. So that's one point. Here's the next thing in verses 5 through 7. He reminds us that suffering or persecution as a Christian should never be interpreted as proof that God doesn't love us, which sometimes we do. In fact, it's just the opposite of that. And sometimes when we're experiencing that moment of discipline, who's the first person to catch the blame? Why are you doing this to me? As if God somehow orchestrated that, and in truth, it's just the opposite of that, what's going on. So these readers have perhaps forgotten the exhortation. He even says it here, you've forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as to sons, and you'll see maybe offset in your Bible. Usually in the New Testament you see it, if it's depending on the way your Bible is printed, you'll see it's offset, and it's indicating that there's a quotation here, and this quotation happens to be from the Old Testament, Proverbs chapter 3, verses 11 and 12, where he says, my son, don't despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives. So he's reminding them, don't think that, and he calls it discipline here, don't think that discipline is meaningless. Now, when he says discipline or the chastening of the Lord, what does he mean by that? Because is the writer suggesting that God is the architect of all the evils that are being placed upon the church? If not, then what's he saying? How can he call this the discipline of the Lord? What is it? Oh, he's allowing it to take place. And even though it might be unjoyful and really tough to endure for the present, is there something that God works through that makes us better? Yeah. And so it's all about perspective. So discipline doesn't mean that God is responsible for evil, but he does permit trials to happen, and he can bring benefits from that. So he's reminding them through this Old Testament quote, don't be discouraged by trials. Instead, don't shun what correction of sins it may provide, and don't give up, because it's possible that through their lack of faith or through their they're giving up, they're losing heart, that they brought some of this on themselves, and the trials remind them they should not lose heart. And that's his point. In fact, when he gets to verse 6, that quotation, he's reminding them that proper training is tough. It's hard. But it gives us correction for our faults, according to verse 6. And so it hurts. In fact, he uses the word here, scourges. He scourges every son whom he receives. The idea would be that we as parents correct our children, and the children don't enjoy it, but it's for their benefit that we do that. And then he'll finish that thought off in verse 7 by saying, if you endure chastening or discipline, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? So God is our Father, and he deals with us just as an earthly father would deal with his own earthly children in correcting them. I think it needs to be noted here, not that the writer's certainly not suggesting that that's the case, that we are not constantly suffering, right? It's not just constant. It's not something all the time going on. But we do struggle, especially when our faults have brought us to the suffering. But the point is, when we endure those bad times and we've got faults, it ought to be the time when we correct it and become better as a result of that. Any thoughts on that before we move on in verses 4 through about verse 7, that quote about discipline and the chastening of the Lord? Yes, count it all joy. And that's tough, because we'll see that back in verse 11 again. He'll say there's a sense in which it's not joyful, because it's not pleasant, but we should rise above the circumstance and count it that way. Art? Yes.
Why?
Yes, because we love them. Yeah, we love them. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. We want them to go to heaven. We know that behavior matters, and so we do discipline our kids. And for them, it's not pleasant when we do that, but it's for their benefit, and hopefully later on they'll understand the benefit of that.
It says here, that kind of chastening and those things are temporary, but in
Yes. He's refining our character to where we can be like God.
And in a general way, just reading through the scriptures and looking at what God has said, that chastens us in a way because we have to make changes.
Yes, we do.
And
Yep.
we have to, adhere to His word. So a lot of times that's tough.
Yeah.
Especially when the world is against us.
Yeah, it's tough. It's a lot easier to cave than it is to do the right thing. It's a lot easier to do that. Take a look at verse 8. Here's the next point. And this kind of goes to what Art was saying. If you're without chastening, of which you've all become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. What's his point there? I think it goes to exactly what Art was saying. Why would any parent discipline their kids? And there's a difference between whatever punishments are involved in discipline. There's a difference in that and just abusing children, right? One is without any affection at all. Why would anybody discipline a child? Spare the rod, spoil the child, right? It's because of love that you do that. And so these trials that we go through that are working to refine our character, how should we see them? What are they actually proof of? They're actually proof of the love of God, according to verse 8. If we were without chastening, if there were none in life, then we would be considered illegitimate and not sons. It means that a life without struggle is actually counterproductive to the life as a child of God. And when that happens, like we have a parent who disciplines us, and later down in life we see, boy, that was such to my benefit, it was a really good thing. We don't accuse earthly fathers or parents of hating us because they disciplined us or lose respect for them, and neither should we think that of God. And so he says in verse 9, we've had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Should we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? And so the idea is if we're willing to extend that credit to parents who discipline because we know they're doing it for our benefit, then we extend the same to God for the same. I don't want to move past verse 9 without noting this. Did you notice at the end of verse 9 that God is called the Father of spirits? What does that mean? Father of spirits.
It says that God is a spirit and we are created in the image of God, so therefore we are spiritual beings.
Yeah, where does there's an immaterial, we are certainly animated in a way unlike any other thing in creation is. So where does that immortal, unseen side of us, who authors that? God does. He is the Father of spirits. And I think that's easy to discern in this passage because when he says the Father of spirits, that is set in contrast to something in this passage. In verse 9 when he says, we have had what kind of fathers? Earthly fathers, human fathers, and what we have here is the contrast between earthly or physical and temporal and immaterial and immortal, right? And God is the author of that. He's the Father of our souls. And I think that's just in passing, that's such a deep reference to something of God. Notice in verse 10, he says, God's discipline is so much greater because it aims at eternity. And I think this goes to what Tommy just said. He said, for they indeed for a few days chasten us as seemed best to them, but he for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. Now, a parent may correct a child, right? And there are parents who have no spirituality to them at all that still correct children because they're trying to train them to be good citizens or productive members of society, and they want to train them to manage money or not steal, and still those are spiritual principles. There are some who do so for spiritual reasons, but if you contrast the earthly reasons that someone might discipline versus the Father of spirits, why does God discipline us? Why is there chastening and struggle in this world? Why is there trial? What should it do to us? We should be better, and I think Jimmy just pointed out, James chapter 1, count it all joy when you fall into all kinds of trials because it works patience, and patience brings along maturity or completion, and so it's hard to see at the moment, but God's actually shaping us to be more like Him as we go through these trials. And we become more faithful if we allow it to have its work. And then finally, he mentions in verse 11, and I think sometimes we're unafraid to, we're afraid to say this, but we should be unafraid to say it because it's the reality of trials. When he says, no chastening seems to be joyous for the present, is it okay to say, this is terrible, this is not fun? Because that's what the writer says, right? It's no fun to go through these trials that we experience, but beyond the grief at present, beyond all the struggle, he says, nevertheless, afterward it yields a peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. So certainly, life with God now, but what's the ultimate end of allowing trials to work on us the way they should? What happens at the end? They're all taken off, you get a crown of life, you get to live with God forever, and so at the end of all of that is eternal life. All right, verse 12. Look at verse 12. In verse 12, here's the question, number 4. Why do you think the writer now mentions the pursuit of peace as part of the counter to our earthly struggles? That's in verses 12 through 17. And what tends to happen to our relationships when we're burdened, when we have struggles we're going through? Let's read it, and then I'll present that question for you to answer. Verse 12. Therefore, strengthen the hands which hang down and the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be dislocated, but rather healed. Pursue peace with all people, and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. Looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this many become defiled, lest there be any fornicator or profane person like Esau, who for one morsel of food sold his birthright. For you know that afterward, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance, though he sought it diligently with tears. There's actually a couple of warnings here. But what is he doing now? Because obviously at the beginning when he says, therefore, he's making a conclusion based on what he's just said about the chastening of the Lord and all that. So what's he telling the readers? Don't quit. Don't give up. And he's reminding us that when we struggle, certain things seem to get cast aside. And there's really two main things that seem to get kind of cast aside when we struggle with our faith, when we're being pressed down and burdened. One of those, when he says in verse 14, is pursue peace with all people. What tends to happen to us personally when we are struggling? We lash out and we push people away, or we're ugly to people. And so he's reminding us, don't let that end suffer as a result of your own personal struggles. And then what's the other part in verse 14? What often crashes as a result of that? Our personal what? Our holiness. Our own personal relationship with God tends to struggle when we're struggling. All right, so let's go back and look beginning in verse 12. I think there's a word picture in verse 12. I know that there could perhaps some references in other places. There's perhaps a passage in Isaiah to which there is an allusion here. But to me, this is just it's a word picture. I think we can see it in our mind's eye when he says, strengthen the hands which hang down and the feeble knees. From a posture standpoint, what tends to happen to our posture spiritually and emotionally when we're going through trials? And where do the hands go? Down. We buckle the knees, and we're just feeling the weight. Because if you're carrying the weight, what happens to your knees after a while? They get weak and they get tired. And what's he telling us? Get your knuckles where? Get them off the floor. Stop dragging your knuckles and stand up and straighten your legs and make straight paths for your feet. This is a word picture, and we can see that. So I think there's profound imagery here. Because we do get weak and we get tired, and there does come a point when we feel unable to bear the weight of it all. Now, I mentioned there's a possible Old Testament allusion here. Hold your place and go back with me to Isaiah chapter 35. Isaiah chapter 35. It's not a quotation, right? It's not quoting from Isaiah, but there is possible allusion here. It's not a direct quote, but I don't think we can dismiss that the language is nearly identical. It's certainly similar. So So look at verse 3. Isaiah 35, look at verse 3. And what's he tell them, first of all? Strengthen what? Strengthen your weak hands and make firm, what does your Bible read as? Your feeble knees. Sound a lot like what's going on in Hebrews chapter 12? So he doesn't directly quote it, and a lot of times there's not even a center column reference or some footnote to bring us back to this passage, but you can't miss that there's some comparison between the two. And this particular passage happens to be talking about the return from Babylonian captivity back to Jerusalem. Now, if you think about Babylonian captivity, they've been there 70 years, almost a century. And where do you think the heart of the people was? You think they were greatly encouraged during their 70 years of captivity? They're probably greatly discouraged. And he's saying, I want you to stand up, and I want you to get your hands off the floor, and I want you to be encouraged. And I think, oh, for sure. Yeah, because there's something about if you, and we all know this, right? If I'm having a really bad week and I come to the assembly, or I don't even have to come to the assembly, but I see you and you're just bouncing off the walls excited about the Lord, is that going to rub off on me? And so it extends one way to another. And Tom?
Putting it in modern language, I think it would be like something like, look up, stand up straight, quit feeling sorry for yourself.
Yeah, quit feeling sorry for yourself.
And look forward.
Yeah. And it's easy, right? We're not minimizing it, because I think verse 11 is a reality of suffering. He's not saying you shouldn't feel like suffering is easy and you're just breezing right through it, because he said it's not pleasant. But I think, Tom, what you said is exactly right, because we do this. We go through some trial and we go, woe is me, nobody's ever gone through this. And he is saying, just quit feeling sorry for yourself and stand up and just move forward, press on. Don't get caught with the baggage behind you. Because I think cowardice is contagious. It's easy to sort of cave in those moments. But I think there's a connection between this passage and what we read in Hebrews chapter 12. So the Jews returning from Babylon to Jerusalem sort of sets the frame of the word picture for us. So verse 13, he says, make straight plans or paths for your feet. This probably is an allusion to Proverbs chapter 4, verse 26. And in other passages, especially in the Old Testament, numerous times, he talks about a straight path, because he doesn't want us to turn where? To the right hand or to the left. You stay in the road. Don't get off on the sides of the road. Just press on in one straight direction. Even if it's narrow, you keep on pressing the straight and the narrow. And then he says, verse 13, so that what is lame may not be dislocated, but rather healed. And I think the idea here is that if we are injured, for example, if I have an injury, I sprain my hand, what do I have to do with my hand? Maybe for a while. I've got to favor it for a while, because if I'm not, what could potentially happen? I could potentially injure it worse than it is. If I fracture my leg, I might have to favor my leg for a little bit so that I don't just clean break my leg. And the idea is, in verse 13, what is lame may not be dislocated. So if you've sprained your foot, you've got to be really careful that you don't actually just go ahead and do more damage to your foot, which means that if you're struggling in the midst of trial, you've got to be really careful, because there could potentially be more damage to come as a result of that. Let's say you've got faith, but you're struggling with your faith. Well, what might be the next step if I don't treat it gingerly, carefully? I could just lose my faith, and I could just turn my back on God. So I've got to treat it carefully, and I've got to nurture that. Because when we have an injury, we have to take caution not to cause more serious damage, and we have to help each other make it out, which Jimmy was just talking about. We've got to help each other do this. And you can imagine marching in a line out of Babylon toward Jerusalem, and you're greatly discouraged. You can see each other just kind of scoop up each other up and say, come on, we can do this. That's the language here. Because, we won't have time to finish it all, because in verse 14, here is the potential dislocation he's talking about. This is the damage he's talking about. The loss of peace, or the disruption of relationships, and then the lack of holiness, which would cause us not to see the Lord. So let's talk about the first of these. We might have time for both. First of all, he says, pursue peace with all people. Is that always possible? Can you always have peace with everybody? No. But at least there could be what? What should there always be? The pursuit of it. We always have to have the pursuit of peace. A couple of things here. Looking at this, is this an optional thing? Can I choose to be in life a cantankerous, not easy to get along with, rejecting, pushing people away? Can I be that kind of a person? Not if I'm going to be at one with the Lord, because I'm supposed to pursue peace with all people. In fact, in the Sermon on the Mount, in the Beatitudes, he said, blessed are the peacemakers. So we're trying to broker peace between people, most of all with God, peace with God and man, but it's not an option here. We have to pursue peace, even though not everybody wants peace. So we do our best, but not everybody will want that. Yeah, Tommy?
Well, I also look at the issue here of following peace. Just because somebody is vicious or mean or whatever toward us, we can still keep inner peace and not respond to them, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like in the last couple of generations, the young people feel they have to defend themselves against anything
Yeah.
that has been said, rather than just, burying it and turn around and walk away.
Yeah.
They feel they have to defend it.
Yeah, you can say what needs to be said and believe in God and hold to His truth, and you may not convince somebody else. But sometimes that's the end of it for other people. You just have to go on and move on, dust your shoes off and move on.
Back to James 1:19.
Yeah,
Slow to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath,
Yeah.
and wrath does not produce wrath.
yeah, that's right. It's good to listen, and it's good to hold the tongue and to extend mercy to people. It's not easy to do, but we're reminded here that one thing that we cannot stop doing in the middle of our own struggles is pursuing peace with people. Here's the second thing that is apparent in this passage, right? So listen to this carefully. Listen to verse 14. Pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. Now, that end is conditioned upon both of these things. Is the pursuit of peace tied to our faithfulness? If you don't pursue peace, who are you not going to get to see at the end? The Lord. Pursue peace and pursue holiness, without which you're not going to see the Lord. So both of these things are tied to that. And relationships tend to get strained in hardships. It just tends to happen. And then here, peace, we would say, the most important is peace with God, obviously, Romans 5 in verse 1. And we'll put a peg in it here because the time is out. Let's pick up here with the and holiness. And then we've got some warnings going to come in verse 15, including a warning that uses the example of Esau, who sold his birthright for one morsel of food. What's he talking about? And why would he remind us of Esau and about things that happened with Esau, even after the fact when he changed his mind and things that were done, he couldn't change that. So why say all that? We'll pick up there in verse 15, and I'll have new notes for chapter 13 on the back table next week, so be looking for those, and we'll remind everybody before and during class of that. Thank you guys for your input. It helps me so much. I appreciate it.